You know how in Sunday school we were taught that the Pharisees were the bad guys? And they were, but they weren't bad because they were bad. They were bad because they were good. And it's pretty easy for Christians to fall into the same trap that the Pharisees did. So who are the Pharisees? And how do I make sure I don't become one? The name Pharisee probably comes from the Hebrew word that means separate. So they are the separate ones. First of all, they separated themselves from the Gentiles. And they also separated themselves from the Jews, who they believed weren't morally and religiously up to snuff. And by this I mean that they didn't follow to the letter what the Pharisees thought was the law. The Pharisees were very serious about the law. They studied the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and they studied the oral traditions and the Talmud, the oral law. This was a lot of law. So why were they so obsessed with all these laws? A little history. God had chosen Israel to be a blessing to all nations. The plan was that by following God's law, Israel would be blessed. And then the other nations would see this blessing, and they would be inclined to follow God's law as well. But Israel didn't do such a good job at following God's law, the Mosaic law. So they weren't blessed. A large portion of Israel was absorbed by the Assyrian Empire, and most of what was left was exiled to Babylon. A remnant of these eventually came back to the Promised Land. The Pharisees took this story very seriously, and the moral they got from that story was that they had better keep the law. And that's not entirely a bad idea, is it? They were so keen on keeping the law that they created a whole bunch of other laws around it, so that if you kept those laws, you couldn't possibly be breaking the Mosaic law. These laws were called, among other things, the Oral Torah. So for instance, the law of Moses says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." The Pharisees were determined to keep this law, so they built a fence around it with a bunch of other clarifications and applications. A protective fence to protect the Mosaic law. You are not to work on the Sabbath. So what is work? Harvesting your crops is work. So to make sure that you can't possibly accidentally harvest something on the Sabbath, they made a rule that you can't pick a fig to snack on as you walk past the fig tree. Hauling stuff would also be considered work. So when Jesus healed a lame man and told him to pick up his mat and go home, the carrying of the mat was considered hauling, a breaking of the Oral Torah. Jesus told the guy to break the Sabbath. Oh, and the act of healing the man? That was also breaking one of those fence laws. The Pharisees' logic was this: if you keep the oral law, you can't possibly break the Mosaic law. So you should focus on the oral law. You can see how the oral tradition became more important than the law of God itself. Jesus says this to them: "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." So Jesus had some problems with the Pharisees. He had a lot more negative things to say about the Pharisees than about the adulterers, thieves, and liars. You know, the bad people. He saved his harshest rebukes for the good people, the law followers. And they didn't like it much either. Actually, they hated him. It wasn't the sexual sinners and the thieves who put Jesus on the cross. So what was Jesus' specific problem with the Pharisees? One of his main problems with them was their legalism. That means they made rule following the most important thing. And making the law the most important thing is especially bad when you altogether misinterpret the law. Jesus encapsulated the whole law and the prophets when he said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." This summation of the law and the prophets says that healing someone is a good thing on whatever day you do it. Jesus got really mad at them in Mark 7. The Pharisees go after Jesus because his disciples are not ceremonially washing their hands after they've been at the market. You see, the Pharisees took the Levitical laws about purity, and they came up with the idea that anybody who wasn't a rule-following Jew like they were needed to be treated like they were contaminated, and certainly the Gentiles. Well, the market had a lot of these kind of people in it, regular people. So the Pharisees considered the market impure, and they had this whole hand-washing purification ritual that they did. Basically looking at other people like they were scum. That behavior and the accompanying attitude is breaking the law, God's law. It's not loving your neighbor. Jesus accuses them of abandoning God's law in favor of their human traditions. There's another problem with legalism. It's an attempt to gain favor with God or impress others by being good, by what you do and what you don't do. And if you're any good at this, there's a good chance that you become filled with pride. But you are not one of those people who aren't so good at it. The Pharisees didn't see themselves as sinners, so they didn't need God or His grace to be saved. I got this. The problem with the Pharisees was that they were obsessed with the externals and didn't attend to what was going on inside them. They were hypocrites. Jesus accused the Pharisees of appearing pious and righteous on the outside, but being corrupt and insincere on the inside. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean." There was this one time when a bunch of Pharisees were in the crowd, and Jesus took the opportunity to goad them again, and he told the parable that has come to be called the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Tax collectors were hated. They were really bad. They were generally corrupt, and they cheated their own people. And they worked for the enemy, the Romans. Here's the story that Jesus told. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get." But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I tell you the truth that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The tax collector understood that he was a sinner, and he understood the degree to which he needed God. The Pharisees were good. They didn't need God or His grace. They had, through their own actions, saved themselves. So those are the Pharisees. So how do you determine if you are one, or prevent yourself from becoming one? Now be careful if you're thinking, how could I be a Pharisee? I'm a good person. Yeah? That's the first symptom. Here are some questions to ask yourself to see if you are not leaning a little too far into the Pharisee way of thinking. Do you go to church every Sunday? I'm not saying that if you go to church every weekend that you're a Pharisee. It's about the possible attitude behind perfect attendance that could be a problem. The Pharisees did a lot of things that God wanted them to do, but their reasons were the problem. So why do you go to church? Maybe just a little because it's expected? You wouldn't like how it would look if you didn't? Or maybe like one of those kids who empties the dishwasher without being asked? You just wanted God to notice how good you are? Kind of a sucking up thing? Do you need Jesus? Of course we all need Jesus. And we all know it. But don't we sometimes think that we need Him just a little less than those people do? I'm a good person, I pay my taxes, I don't sleep around, and I don't flip people off when I'm driving. Do you talk a lot about the things you are against? You know, listening to secular music, abortion, gay marriage, that kind of stuff. When I was a kid, the church I went to was against Sunday shopping. So you didn't go out for lunch after church. No way. But most of the adult men smoked. But just down the road, there was this other church. Right after the Sunday service, everyone would get in their cars and drive to the local restaurant. My people condemned these people, even though we waved to them as they drove by. And as they drove by, they condemned my people because they were smoking. The Pharisees were very interested in anything that would clarify the borders between our people and those people. Don't you think that the world should know us by what we're for, rather than what we're against? Do you give your time and money to Christian causes? Again, doing these things is not a problem. The problem is the attitude behind it. Do you think that God needs your help in order to achieve His purposes in the world? Do you see things in black and white? The problem here is oversimplification. The Pharisees didn't look at people's motives, they just judged the behavior, the external. You know, the idea that people are poor because they're lazy, or people are addicted to drugs because they have no will, or people are divorced because they lack commitment. These are things that Pharisees might think. They judged their own actions as good, and they judged Jesus' actions as bad. How do you read your Bible? Have you noticed that you have no problem with anything that you read in the Bible? And every sermon that you hear makes you think, oh, I wish blank were here to hear this. Or, see, I am right. The Bible, properly read, will not simply confirm our already firmly held convictions. The Bible should challenge us now and then. Did you notice that whenever the Pharisees or even Jesus' disciples had things pretty clear in their mind, Jesus would challenge their thinking? The Word should challenge ours. How important do you think it is to conform to the Christian lifestyle? This goes beyond the submission to Jesus as Lord of life. It also includes a bunch of things that are unique to our narrow way of being a Christian in our particular part of the world, in our particular time. You have to stop swearing or smoking or wearing those clothes or whatever. And you only read books by Christian authors, and only listen to praise and worship music, and only watch G-rated movies. Pharisees had all these ways of being in the world that separated them from the world, and this separation was kind of a problem. How many non-Christian friends do you have? This is another one of those separation things. In this case, we are separating ourselves from other people. Jesus ended up hanging around the poor and the prostitutes and eating with tax collectors. Another related question is, how many things are you involved with that are outside the church? Being involved in only church-related activities almost every night of the week means you are not likely to be involved in your community at all. If we play community sports, or join a volunteer group, or are involved in a special interest club, then we meet different kinds of people, and we develop meaningful relationships with them, friendships even. To all these separation issues, how can we be salt in the world if we never make it out of the salt shaker? And number 10, when you are rebuked, are you offended? Does this list piss you off? Jesus rebuked the Pharisees, and they got defensive and then really angry. Now, before you get really mad at me for being an arrogant, judgmental Pharisee, I've gone through this whole list myself, all 10 things, and I've got to admit that I've got a little Pharisee in me. The first step is admitting it. The second step is to embrace the gospel. So what does that mean? The gospel is that we don't need to live up to some high behavioral standard. Trying to do this is such a tremendous burden, because we can never do it. We can't even live up to our own standards for being a good person. If you can't even live up to your own moral standards, how are you ever going to live up to God's standard? You never will. And once you realize this, that you're a sinner, you begin to realize that those people are really no better than you are. The good people are no closer to heaven than the bad people. The only way that any of us can become right with God is if God Himself makes us right with Him. And He did that. On the cross, He took our place so that we could take His place. He died so that we could live. He was rejected so that we could be accepted as the sons of the living God. Once you understand this, there's no other response but gratitude. You see how freeing that is? The reason you're good is not because you have to. It's because you're grateful for what Jesus did. That inner Pharisee sort of just evaporates. God's grace is so big that when we really take it in, good people become grateful people. And that makes all the difference. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.